On Thursday, January 24th, Grasslands Public Relations hosted a special evening devoted to the complicated future of cannabis media at the Denver Press Club, and the room was buzzing in more ways than one. Panelists included journalists and editors from old media, the Denver Post, the Associated Press, Marijuana Business Daily, and the Denver Business Journal. Podcaster Joe Dolce from the Brave New Weed podcast and two incredible social media influencers added the new media perspective. Grasslands founder and CEO Ricardo Baca, a veteran journalist with more than 20 years' experience at daily newspapers, hosted the festivities and kept the conversation lively. For those who couldn't attend, we're pleased to provide you with the recording of the evening's festivities. Listen in and please share.
My name is Andre Burke, and I'm a cannabis columnist for Forbes. I'm also a business advisor. I'm based in Los Angeles, California. And it's so great I'm just actually delighted to be here. Grasslands for inviting me. And originally, Ricardo told me about this. Hey, we're going to have a little get-together, right? And now there's a line out front and there. I could barely get in. They're checking IDs. So it's exciting to be part of this entire thing. And I've spent the last few days, really kind of paying homage to the Silicon Valley of the cannabis industry here in Colorado and seeing what some of the companies are doing. It's been very exciting. So tonight we have what I think is a great agenda. It's going to be the complicated future of cannabis media. Anybody who's in the space knows that it is indeed very complicated. And so it'll be broken into two parts, which I think are great and very complementary. So the first we're going to have here is the influencer marketing panel, talking about the importance of influencers in this space, particularly with the limitations in advertising and what we can do in the space. And the second is the media panel, which I hope will include what to do and what not to do in speaking and trying to talk to journalists. So first of all, I wanted to give a shout out to some of our sponsors. We have some great people who made tonight possible. The first one is Boulder Botanical Bioscience Laboratories. I went and saw these guys yesterday. They're out in Golden, Colorado, doing some really exciting stuff, building a massive facility. Can America Brands, I don't know if you guys are here. I ate crickets with the CEO last night, true story. I'll tell you more about it on the break if you want to know. Clientele Capital Management Group for any small businesses, marijuana businesses in the industry looking for funding, looking to scale, looking to eliminate costs, some cost cutting, and to expand. These are the guys, the father-son duo you want to work with to do that. They're taking on Colorado by storm. Compassionate Cultivation out of Texas. They work with people with epilepsy. Denver Press Club, right, for having us here. Go Fire. This is a small, homegrown kind of small business in Colorado taking on big pharma and winning. Follow my column and you'll hear more about that. Mary Jane's Medicinals. They do topicals. Of course, the National Cannabis Industry Association. Stowe Responsible, never met them, but I'm sure they're great. We'll get there. Willie's Remedy, talked to them today, fantastic, hemp-based and kind of the sister brand to Willie's Reserve, which anybody who was at the Emerald Cup, that's some fascinating and fantastic cannabis products as well. So, excited to have invited, which is carefully selected, I might add, people who play different roles in the industry, in both influencers and media and publishing. And what I'm told you can expect is a lively conversation, so the pressure's on for all three of you ladies over here. And I'm going to go ahead and right now and hand it over to you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Andre. Many people think that social media is just for teenagers sharing selfies. But if your brand is ever going to become relevant in the cannabis industry, you need to understand and invest in influencer marketing. Influencer marketing is not going away. In fact, it's going to keep growing. The two women next to me exemplify the power of grassroots community building and the importance of authenticity. Through years of building their platforms, they now manage tens of thousands of followers who engage with them 24/7 and trust them as they would a friend. If you're not following these women on Instagram and other platforms, please get out your phone right now. Seated to my right is Whitney Adrian, also known as Sunny Days. Whitney has been in the industry since 2016 and built a social media and influencer programs for major Colorado cannabis brands. She now consults on social media strategy for cannabis brands across the country. Next to Whitney is Izzy Arellano, also known as Izzy Blaze. Izzy has worked in the cannabis industry since 2015, when she was the host and star of the Izzy Blaze Show on YouTube. From that, Izzy has grown a dedicated following with her entertaining video content. She currently has the #1 backwoods tutorial rolling video on YouTube with over 4 million views. In 2018, she was also chosen as one of 5 influencers as High Times Women in High Places. Last year, Izzy curated the first ever LGBTQIA times cannabis event in Denver at Tetra Lounge, titled the Glitter Bong Bash. Finally, she is helping run Bonfire Cannabis Company Dispensary, while also focusing on her own content creation and curating revolutionary events this year. Thank you both for joining me.
And who are you?
And I am McCarter, also known as McCarter Gets High. I manage Grasslands social media program and my title is Influencer Relations Specialist. So we're gonna get started with the first question of how you both got started as an influencer and came into the cannabis space. Izzy, can we start with you?
So I actually moved here from Texas, and I didn't really smoke. And I met the first people that were my friends were the people from Mass Roots. From there, I just networked for a year and a half, basically selling myself, which was no brand, just my personality. And then I got the Izzy Blaze Show, and then that's when I really started delving deep into the cannabis industry.
Funny enough, I also started at Mass Roots. Izzy and I didn't know each other until like a year and a half ago, though, so it's kind of weird. But yeah, I was doing sales there. I was selling advertising space, and one of the biggest demands I saw from my clients were for influencer marketing posts. So kind of just saw the demand for it and went for it because I like cannabis and I like photography. So.
And let's talk a little bit why cannabis is an ideal industry for influencer marketing. Whit, do you want to start?
Sure. I'd say, I guess first and foremost, cannabis is definitely one of those things, as we all know, that's very taboo. And there's a lot of stigma that surrounds the cannabis industry. Whoops. And I think it basically just provides a really great source of information for people to learn about the plant, learn the different applications of it, learn about what products people that they trust, that they see as friends, like you mentioned, might recommend. So yeah, I see it as like a niche industry that definitely needs some help getting in front of the right consumers.
Yeah, I think kind of off of what Whitney said, I think it's cool that we get to kind of pioneer in a new industry. One thing that I really love about business is the risk. And anybody who's in cannabis, doesn't matter what you're doing, it is a risk, okay? Let's just be completely honest. And so that, for me, I just realized, like, I get to pioneer it, make my own rules, and not follow rules with 100 other people. Let's do it. Let's do it.
I like that. Definitely. What other obstacles do influencer marketers face in today's space? Izzy?
I think a lot of the obstacles that we're dealing with is it's really taboo. I think a lot of people are coming based off of opinion versus fact, and we're riding on a stigma. We're riding on a perception, and I think a lot of what Whitney and I try to do is change that perception, show cannabis is not my life. It can assimilate to my life. It's a part of my life. And I think initially when you think of somebody who's smoking cannabis is like, oh, they're a stoner. You think of Cheech and Chong. You think of like nobody, like a stoner, just like nobody who does anything. So I think you're dealing with generational differences. You're dealing with people who are afraid to take risks, who are afraid to invest. And overall, just like I think stigma is really what we're fighting, because that's really why people are so resistant against it. I think so.
I would definitely say that personally I mainly use Instagram, and there's like this craze going around of people getting deleted off of Instagram with no explanation provided. There's no parameters that we're supposed to be following. So it's really confusing to know like how to do my job and like what rules they want us to play by, because it's not like we're here to break the rules. Well, some of us, but I definitely want to. I try to treat it as a legitimate business, and it's definitely unfortunate that our industry faces things that people in like the beauty industry or fitness industry don't see at all. They don't have to worry about their platform being taken from them and that source of income just being like ripped away for no reason. So.
That kind of makes you think like virality is the goal, and the second that a video goes viral, that gets your chances of being deleted over 90% because it's just drawing attention. With the algorithm, you're getting comments, you're getting views. So a lot of the people that are getting deleted because they're being successful at what we're trying to do.
So it's like you have to like ride this line of like,
it's a weird
I try to make it big or do I like sneak under the radar? It's kind of weird.
It's
really
a muddy
know.
water for sure. It's muddy water.
It's unique for cannabis, I think.
And how do you both vet and select brands that you want to work with?
First, I drop my phone, and then I definitely make sure that any brand I work with, their values and aesthetic aligns with mine. If I click onto their page and it's like a bunch of like half nearly clothed girls, I'm probably going to pass on that because that's not what I align my personal brand with. So yeah, basically just if they look like they would align with my goals, that's great. If they have actual marketing goals and a marketing budget, that's even better. So yeah, those are definitely things I look for.
Yeah. Did you know products don't pay bills?
No, I heard
Did
that.
you know free product doesn't pay bills?
I did hear that.
I heard about that.
For me, it's really the same. Like if you look at our page, like Whitney has one of the most beautiful profiles I've ever seen. If you haven't followed her, it'll make you mad because it's so beautiful. Mine definitely, I go with like lifestyle. Like what you see is what you get. So it's like a lot of the same energies. That's why I do really well with people and events and things like that. So for me, it's just really who aligns with me. Like I was saying yesterday to them for a short amount of time, what you're buying represents this like status. And am I trying to market to somebody who can't afford a $400 vaporizer? Am I targeting somebody who can spend a little over $25 on something and assimilate to their lifestyle, not strive to not pay rent because they want to lift this status? So I just want to be somebody that people can assimilate to. It's a real lifestyle. I think that's one thing that I love about Colorado social media is here it's like, this is what we have. Let me show you where you can get it. We're so accessible. We're so affordable. It's beautiful. California, it's like, look at this 10,000 necklace that I have. You can't touch me. You can't get it, but good luck. And so that's what I love about Colorado is it keeps us humble. You can see it when we travel to California too. We stick out. We stick out, you know?
We look like slobs.
We look at it like, you guys are so chill. We're like, what?
That's great. Continuing on that trend, how do you both construct your feed based on your own content and lifestyle and preferences, especially compared to your sponsored content?
This is like my favorite part of Instagram. I really like the visual planning aspect of it, just like making it flow because I kind of see it as like a first impression for anyone who clicks onto my page. Whether it's a brand who might want to hire me to do content creation or influencer marketing, or it's a person who might support me as an influencer, whatever it is, I want their first impression of me to be clean and professional and like inviting, I guess, approachable. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
With my page, it's literally what you see is what you get. So it's like now that you guys have heard me talk and see, if you look, my captions, my posts, everything is really assimilating to who I am as a person. So with the teams that I work for, you know, I'm trying to be a part of your team, not just try to not try to sell you something. I want to be part of something more. And so I really want to deliver myself. And so with me, it's like the Izzy Blaze experience. There are some aesthetic pictures, but I'm just like crazy. I know you guys can see it. Let's just be honest here. Okay. But that's what it is. It's just an experience. And so that's what I want it to be. I call myself the good time guru because I want you to enjoy myself. I want it to be intangible. And so that's kind of what I'm going for is just this overall experience was like cannabis is part of it, but it's just like an all encompassing thing.
So do you ever feel that you're compromising yourself or your values with sponsored content or ads?
Okay, here we go.
Wits first.
I would say my main goal is to not do that. I think that people should be staying true to who they are and what they stand for. That's what makes them an influencer. That they're speaking for what they stand for, and that it's inspiring other people to do good things with their lives. I am really picky about like visually not making my page look really spammy and promoted. So I am all about like organic ways of working in stuff to like that it, like Izzy said, assimilates to my lifestyle and just blends in pretty well.
How many posts a month would you say are sponsored?
I try to keep it like percentage-wise, like 25%. Yeah. Yeah.
Izzy?
Hi. I think one thing that's really cool is that Winnie and I have been in this space for so long that we are now at the availability to say, no, we're not going to put that on our page. And we have our aesthetic. We've kind of seen like what our journey is. And I think a lot of influencers will do a lot of sponsored and like repping, and they'll rep 15 glass companies because you want that exposure, you want to get out there. But for me, I definitely try to keep it around that same amount, 25%, because I don't want to be somebody who's constantly selling. Nobody wants to go somewhere and get sold. You go everywhere you go, you get sold. You know what I mean? I'm not like a website that's going to sell you something. I'm trying to like give you who I am versus sell you on who I am. And I think that's exactly what we're doing. So, yeah, I think sometimes you can compromise by being too reppy. You're constantly selling. I think that it's just like you're trying too hard.
Yeah. I think it's also a little confusing for your audience when you're repping like 20 different glass brands or 20 different dispensaries, and they're like, where do I shop? What do I do? So I think it's smart as like an influencer to stick to a set amount of companies that don't quite overlap, because I think it's confusing it just looks spammy to me.
Definitely. And how about, what role do you think these platforms play in mainstreaming cannabis culture?
How so? Like it's Instagram and YouTube and social. I think so right now, since it's because influencers are so accessible and it's a little bit more affordable, and we're assimilating to a lifestyle where it's like we're actually smoking. We actually go to these events. We all do that. I think it's a much more powerful tool than like the outdoor industry. Whitney and I went to an event recently where they don't care about influencer marketing. They like don't see the point in it. And so you're getting to utilize the people who are actually out there. And I think I assimilate more to a person than to a business. I'm willing to talk more to like one-on-one to somebody who's like more of a homie than a company who's trying to pitch me on something. So I think that going through people humanizes the company, humanizes the product. And I think we're losing a lot of that in social media. So if you can deliver like who you are in a more vulnerable sense, which I think we're both multifaceted in that sense, I think that's how it is beneficial for companies in the cannabis industry.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I would just add that I think, like I said, it's still a taboo subject in industry, and just seeing normal people like Izzy and I interacting with cannabis, with the industry, with all the things going on around it, just chips away at the stigma a little bit more and more, and it shows people that there are other people out there consuming that aren't stoners or what people picture them to be, like non-productive. Like, we are fucking driven. Excuse my language. We're driven. We're busy, and we're ready to work. So we just want to show that, and it's really great to have a platform to do that.
I think there is a difference though in cannabis content and stoner content. And I think it's important to differentiate that, because it is two different demographics. Because even if you don't live in a legal state, you've probably smoked. You've probably bought some. So it's like people can still assimilate to it, but there is a difference in that content. And I think we've learned to refine that.
Definitely. In your opinion, what is the biggest mistake you see cannabis brands make?
I would say obviously I'm biased because this is what I do for a job, but I think that cannabis brands aren't investing enough in marketing strategy. It's such a saturated industry at this point. Like, you hear about a new brand launching every single week, and you're just like, how are they going to do that? And like, what's their plan? And you have to be really strategic and creative, and influencer marketing is a great way to do that, and just personalize your brand and get in front of the right people that you're trying to connect with.
I just think that it's like one thing that I saw, especially in the beginning, that's something you and I talked about a lot, was sex sells. And I think people really try to push this like sexual appealing, but that just created a quantity of followings, but not a quantity. So you weren't seeing return. You're not seeing any of that. And I think now people are starting to shift to somebody that more people can relate to, something that people can actually be like, oh yeah, I could see myself doing that. I know that I'm not a little cute little babe 24 looking good in a bikini. I mean, I still look good, but you know what I mean? Like, I know that she's probably going to sell more of whatever she's selling than what I'm selling, because it's like I'm not using that. So I think that they really pushed that in the beginning, which it worked, but now they're noticing that it's not. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that I have seen, which I believe in empowerment and female empowerment, but I think they're not using it for that.
I would relate it to the lust, not love.
Yes.
Initially, it looks good, but you want to make a lasting relationship.
Right. Longevity.
Yeah, exactly. All right, this is my last question. How can influencers work in tandem with traditional media outlets?
This was something that I learned with the Glitter Bong Bash. Was we were just focusing on cannabis and the LGBTQIA community, and then we started getting some love from the Westward. And through the Westward, it definitely provided us a different demographic. I know that not everyone in this room may have an Instagram. Not everybody in this room may have a YouTube or a Facebook. And so I want to appeal to all those demographics who may have more, who believe in things with a little bit more legitimacy, like Made in Shaolin with Forbes. That skyrocketed them. Being in Westward gave us more legitimacy because I had an older crowd come to Tetra. So it's just finding a way to show them like, hey, this is a different demographic. We're doing something different, but we can work together to grow. And I think it is really important that we try to find that complete merge, especially because what we're doing is effective. What all of these newspapers and magazines are doing has been effective for years. So it's like, let's combine forces and see how we can grow together.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think you definitely just get in front of people that you would never reach before. There was one point when I noticed after being interviewed by someone for Adweek, I got all this like influx of messages, emails from like friends and family who were not quite supportive before, but then once they saw it, a little judgmental before, you know what I'm saying? And once they saw Adweek next to my name, they took it a little bit more seriously and wanted to know about the industry and like how they could get involved. Now people are like wanting to invest and, start businesses. So I think it definitely adds just, like, as you said, a layer of legitimacy, and just cross-promotion never hurts anyone.
Yeah, credibility for sure. More to the name. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you both so much. That's all the questions I have.
Thank you guys.
This concludes the portion of the event discussing social media and cannabis. And now, the second half of the event, which discusses the future of cannabis in journalism.
Panel. So we're here to talk about the complicated future of cannabis media, but first I think we deserve the opportunity to kind of know how we got here. Obviously you see some traditional media outlets here. We have the biggest trade in the game, and we have a self-starter podcast, author, journalist doing his own thing, and that kind of diversity in this panel is very intentional. I wanted to bring together people who are doing this differently, people who are doing the same thing or different things, but it all kind of falls underneath that banner of cannabis journalism, and it speaks to the breadth of the current landscape of the media covering marijuana and this new industry. Now, I have a question that I want to start out with for the traditional mainstream folks. So that's Jonathan, Katie, and Leanne. Do you remember the moment when you realized that your outlet was going to seriously cover, report on, and investigate on weed? I mean, Leanne, you and I were working together at the time in the same newsroom, and do you remember how you reacted to the news that Greg Moore wanted to appoint a marijuana editor and create a standalone section?
What I remember most about it was that we described it as we're going to cover marijuana like we cover alcohol. And we're going to, and we would cover alcohol, and we're going to treat it with the same skepticism, but also just recognize that this is a legal part of the landscape in Colorado now. That said, I also remember you being on like national TV and thinking, really, Rick? Wow. But it was...
Sounds about right.
But mostly, I was proud. I was proud that we were willing and able to step into that space, and proud that the Denver Post had the same kind of sort of initiative and experimental approach to what we were doing, that was something we were willing to try.
And Katie, what about you? When you came to Denver to write for the Associated Press, arguably the world's largest wire service, and then cannabis ended up being a part of your job title in one of your beats.
Yeah, that was not the plan. I can blame Kristen for that. I actually got hired to cover law enforcement and legal issues, and then found out when I arrived that she was taking a new job with Hemp Industry Daily, and they needed somebody to step in and continue covering the industry. It really predated me coming to Colorado. I think there were reporters in different states and cities who, by nature of their location, had to get smart about this quickly. Most of them were state government reporters kind of covering that process, and then they had to step up when it became real and actually get out there in the field and cover it. We're now gearing up to go to a different level. In 2018, AP created a cannabis team with reporters in different states with different specialties because there was that same recognition that this is a big part of the economy in a growing number of states, and we need to treat it with the seriousness that it deserves.
And of course, Katie, as some of you know this, Katie's referring to Kristen Wyatt, who was at AP and is now working with Chris over at one of the biggest trades. But Jonathan, you're at Denver Business Journal. This is a Denver business, and you guys are stepping up your cannabis journalism game over there. Do you remember how you reacted when you heard that was a new initiative?
Yeah, actually, it's a slightly different approach on my side because I'm a relatively new editor. We have a new leadership team at the Denver Business Journal, and we have made an intentional and conscious effort to devote more resources and coverage to the industry, because we saw that this is something that's been, adult use for 5 years, much longer than that medical. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry when you look at the total economic impact within the state, and it deserved more coverage. And so we've actually made that decision, and I'm thrilled with it. It's something I was blogging about for years before I started, and I thought basically it's about time.
Chris, I'm curious, because you,
It is about time,
Chris, you have a history in mainstream journalism. Can you speak to that? But also now you run the world's largest cannabis trade journal. What would the Chris of 10, 12 years ago said to you now if he saw you doing what you're doing, crisscrossing the globe, speaking in Israel and Jamaica and Berlin about weed?
I would have thought something went seriously off the rails with my career. I used to work at the Rocky Mountain News here as a business reporter for a long time. And that closed, and I moved to South Korea and stayed in kind of the mainstream journalism realm. And then when I left for South Korea in 2009, which is right when the Rocky closed, marijuana wasn't something we were covering. I was on the business desk. It wasn't a thing because there really wasn't any businesses here, even though Colorado had legalized medical marijuana previously. And so when I came back 2 years later, that's when there were more dispensaries in Denver than Starbucks. And that happened in 2 years. And it was still off everyone's radar. So I came back, and me and the two co-founders, they hired me to launch this, and the opportunity was there to cover this industry like a mainstream professional trade publication would, because at the time no one was doing that at all. It was, Joe Stoner in his basement, writing a blog saying he's covering the industry and railing on the government. So we started it, and I brought my business journalism experience to it to launch this and build our audience. In the early days, it was just me doing that. And so we've built that up over time, and I saw the opportunity, wanted to get out of mainstream media, and thought this would be an interesting industry to cover, and that proved true. So now we have 65 employees, and roughly a third are editorial, and we do big events and things as well. So we've taken a different approach, kind of a traditional trade publication approach, where we have big business events that fund a lot of what we do, but we are able to cover the industry and hire in a time when a lot of media isn't.
And so does that mean the journalism is a loss leader and the events kind of cover that tab?
Not necessarily. I mean, we have a print magazine that is profitable and doing very well, and we can monetize our digital assets through the website too. It was a loss leader before, but it's getting to the point of self-sustainability. But we have these big events, that allow us to do that journalism. So we're trying to find a way to build up the journalism too, to make it self-sufficient. But the events and the market research are really, the revenue drivers right now.
And when Chris says they do some big events, it's a bit of an understatement. As some of us in the room know, they produce the largest cannabis business conference in the world every November, now December, in Las Vegas, in addition to a couple other shows, international, as well as May in New Orleans. But Joe, I mean, years ago you were the editor of one of America's largest men's magazines, Details. Were you guys covering cannabis then? But also, did legal marijuana even seem like a reality at that time?
We did cover cannabis, and LSD, and psilocybin, and Burning Man. This was a long time ago also. I'm an old person.
What year are we talking?
This is like early part of the decade, early 2000s. But I can tell you that I was here 5 years ago now, just as cannabis was legalizing, starting my reporting on Brave New Weed, and I hooked into a bunch of extractors. And at that time, I was taken to a new startup called Incredibles, and they were making chocolate bars, like 180 milligrams of chocolate bar, and that wasn't enough. And but no one was there. I mean, I was like this guy, like fish out of water completely. I was hanging with these extractors, and they were like sniffing tange and talking about all this stuff. And I was like, what are you guys doing? What is going on here? And to look at this room now in the Denver Press Club, only 4 or 5 years later, is pretty amazing, really. Something really happened. I didn't answer your question, but...
What was the question?
I don't remember the question. Why don't you answer it?
I don't remember.
The end of the question was, didn't legal marijuana even seem like it could
No.
be a reality in your lifetime
No.
back in the early 2000s?
No, but I lived in New York, where it never mattered. New York is the biggest black market in the world.
It never mattered if you were white.
Exactly. No, precisely. Forgive me for omitting that. And I am. And, I didn't even understand the criminal justice and issues until I really wrote that book. Because, it's just not on the tip of our tongues. Or it wasn't at the time. It is now. And I think, I do live in New York, and they're just starting to regulate, and part of the New York regulations are to give a lot back to disadvantaged communities. So we're waiting to see how that rolls out. But that's pretty encouraging. That is also a long way. That's a long thing in 4 years. We've come a long way.
It is. I mean, all of us were lied to in public school. Geez, everybody's dropping their phones.
And college, and graduate school, and beyond.
Yeah, we were all lied to. Isn't it amazing that consistently we can get a group of people together this large and recognize that for the most part, probably 99% of us were lied to in the schools that we went to about this substance. And we're going to talk about that misinformation some later. But I kind of want a question for the panel. We'll start with Chris and come this way. But I'd love to get the brief of how each of you got here within the context of this conversation of cannabis journalism or journalism centered on cannabis. So maybe take 2-ish minutes apiece and give us your quick personal story of beyond what you've already said. How did you get here? How did your outlet get here? I know Leanne has an interesting story to tell there, but Chris, we're starting with you. So 2-ish minutes apiece. How you got here with cannabis journalism?
Yeah, I mean, the dirty little secret from when we started in 2011. So if you're a journalist in the room, go back to 2011 and think about how that would look to your colleagues or former colleagues that you were helping start a marijuana publication. That's what I meant earlier about I would have thought my career went off the rails because I didn't come from the kind of cannabis culture. And at that time, it was very, very strong that if you were in the industry, you needed to be part of that culture. And I was not, neither were the co-founders at that time. So we were kind of outsiders in a lot of ways. But we approached it with the professional view that this industry, to thrive and to succeed, needs people to take this seriously and write the type of business content that people need to grow their businesses. And again, that did not exist in any fashion in this industry. And it's no different than you'd see in any other industry, the types of things we started providing, but no one from that background, from our backgrounds, had done that. So again, we saw that opportunity. I remember in the early days telling former colleagues what I was doing, and they did kind of be like, okay, I didn't know, are you going to start a High Times type publication or what? Some of those people now work for me and they're in this room, but no, but we've grown a lot, so that's been nice. But in those early days, there was a lot of skepticism and paranoia. And I remember going to an event, one of my first events in Denver, and it was with an industry group here. And I was, just came to meet people, and I went to the bathroom, and I was standing there, and another guy came in that's part of the group, and he started talking to me, which is always awkward when you're in the bathroom. But he said, you seem pretty cool, but I can't tell, if you're an FBI agent or not. So there was skepticism of that end, and as a journalist trying to write seriously about this industry, people did think, who are you? So there was a tough. The first year or two was tough in that regard, but so again, our interest was really seeing an industry that needed this kind of professionalism. And I think we really helped foster professionalism in this industry, not only through what we wrote on the site and setting the tone for the industry when there was nothing else out there like that, but through our serious market research reports that we were doing, and then our events where, the events at that time were medical, quote unquote, medical marijuana events that were supposed to be focused on patients, and there'd be Cypress Hill playing, and the expo floor was full of bongs and rolling papers. And that's not what we felt the industry should exude if we want to be taken seriously. And it wasn't a business conference, or a medical conference. So that was our goal, was to help professionalize it, and I really think we did. And I'll just wrap up by saying we had a conference 2 or 3 years ago, and our keynote was Ralph Nader. And one of the things he said during it, he held up our magazine because he had flipped through it to prepare for his talk. And he said, this is exactly what the industry needs. And it was a cover story on the problems in testing, which I know the Cannabis did the same kind of things when you were there. And he said, this is what it needs. It needs a watchdog. And it needs people who aren't afraid to write about the issues in the industry that are affecting everyone. And that was our mission and our purpose. So, excellent. Yeah.
Yeah, so our path through this has been interesting and troubled at times, and evolving, and continues to evolve. It started, as we talked about before, with the Cannabis, which, as Rick described, even itself speaks to how new cannabis journalism was at the time. When we described it as some news, some features, it had reviews, it had a television show, it had a little of all of this. And at some point, we're like, what is it exactly? Is this a news site? Is it reviews? Is it a business-to-business site? Is it business-to-consumer? Is it a little of both? Is it serious journalism? Is it fun? What exactly is this site? And you sort of saw how we were approaching the journalism of this, and the industry evolve through that as we began to kind of understand that we went from just saying we're going to cover legal marijuana to becoming more sophisticated about what that coverage actually looks like, and what we were trying to accomplish and what audience we were trying to serve. one painful thing we realized is that marijuana coverage, in the way we were doing it, is super hard to monetize. It was hard to get the advertising support. It was hard to get the support to sustain 7 full-time trained journalists on the site. And that became a really difficult process that we had to go through as we looked at, is what we have created something that we can actually say is profitable? And that's just a fact of life in journalism. An interesting out part of that has been, so we brought that staff down to really nothing. The site still exists, but it would be absurd to say we really staff that site. Although I will say on any given day, you'll be happy to know how to make canna butter. Remains one of our most viewed stories, day in and day out, year in and year out. It's a traffic winner. We then began to think about the journalism in other ways. And in the earliest days, it became a thing, well, this is something Rick does over here with his staff, tucked over here in this corner of the room. It's certainly not really something the whole staff covers. It's not something that is integrated into what the Denver Post does as part of our daily mission. And that's been an interesting change to sort of watch, that now, whether you're covering state government or city hall or whatever it might be, it's no longer this niche sort of subject, but rather integrated into what everybody covers. That's not to say, and I expect that, I hope that pretty soon we've got an opening that will make it at least a big chunk of it will be covering the industry again. But it has been interesting to watch it just become part of the general culture, so that you have the series we did around Christmas, where it was reported on basically by our government reporters, who are all kind of monitoring that, and that's fun. That's been interesting and fun to watch as it just takes over. I don't think anything says mainstream quite so much as bringing it out of a corner of the newsroom in its own little area into where everybody considers it part of their job to cover what's going on in the industry. So I think those would be my high points.
Yeah, it's worth adding that, the cannabis and our coverage in general would have never been anything without the regular contributions of the Denver Post staff room, the legislative reporters in City Hall. Anyway, Joe.
So my story is a little different. I used to visit my elderly mother, who was being taken care of by my sister and her husband. And one morning, very early, he woke me up and he said, "Hey, you want to see my new hobby?" And I said, "Yeah, okay." And he took me down underneath their house into a locked room that led into another locked room with a lot of white noise machines and air filters going on. And he unzipped these 2 aluminum strip bags and he said, "These are the girls." And I've been growing, for the last couple of years. And now my sister is a Jehovah's Witness, and I said, "Does Susan know about this?" "No." Does mom know about this?" "No." "Does your mother know, who lived in the house also?" "No." So I said, "What are you growing?" He said, "Super Lemon Haze. Want to try it?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." But I hadn't, I grew up smoking cannabis, and then I had stopped, like many people, in adulthood, and really slowed down on it. So I didn't really know what Super Lemon Haze was. And I tried it and I really liked it immediately. And I thought, I got to get back to know this thing again. And I did. And I spent some time with some Super Lemon Haze. And one day I was having lunch with my lawyer and I was a bit lost in my career. I had left magazines and was sort of not sure what I was going to do. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm a little lost. And I'm smoking a lot of Super Lemon Haze." And he said, "I love Super Lemon Haze." Now, Bob was 76 at the time, and he ran like one of the biggest entertainment law firms in the country. "You do?" He said, "I've known you for 10 years. How did I never know this?" And he said, "God damn it, somebody's got to write a book that justifies all these people that love weed, that gives them some reason to love it, because no one's talking about this, Joe. God damn it, go write that book." And I said, "All right." And I went to Amsterdam. It was my birthday of, another year. And I went out to Amsterdam on my birthday to look at the cannabis cup. And it was like a nightmare for me. I was in the wrong person in the wrong place. I was the only guy without a beard. I was the only guy walking around with a notebook. They thought I was a narc. And really nobody was talking to me, and it was cold and it was raining. And I didn't even like the pot in Netherlands. And on my last day, I met a guy who was American, and his name was Adam Dunn, and he was this oil maker. And he said, how you doing? I said, I'm not happy here. He said, yeah, the lights are going out here. You got to come to Denver. That's where it's all happening. And that's how I began to report my book. I found a story there, I found these guys, and it took me on a travel log. I wrote a travel book through the new world of cannabis, which is, if you can get that job, get it. It was great. And it's sort of the subjects, after I wrote the book, it just stuck with me. I just realized that there's a lot to say about this, and it does intersect all these different points. And okay, I'm a single operator, I don't have a news organization behind me, but I'm just gonna stand out and see if I can do it.
And that's where the podcast came from.
That's where the podcast came from, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Brave New Weed, subscribe on your...
Yeah, subscribe to it. Go on your Instagram and follow us. Where are those other two? Where are those other two women? I want you on my podcast. Because in a way, they are the future. Yeah, that's enough of me. You're up.
All right, Katie.
So my first experience with any kind of cannabis industry was actually in Georgia, where I was covering state government, and there was a medical push. It started with parents of kids who had severe epileptic disorders, as many states did, and then I covered that for a couple of years. They had a very, very limited kind of, if you find it somewhere else and you bring it here, you won't get arrested style program. And then I came to Colorado, as I mentioned. AP had recently lost our in-house expert on covering cannabis, and they kind of threw me in the deep end of the pool and said, welcome, you're gonna cover this, surprise. And shortly after that, I tried to get up to speed as quickly as I could, met with a lot of the people in this room just to say, what in the world have I missed in the last 5 years? A lot. Just catch me up. And I'm still learning. Every conversation I have, I feel like it's a total new step. I have to kind of rethink things and strategize. What does this mean for AP's coverage as a global news organization? We're typically not going to write about a product launch. We're going to write about, what does this say about how the consumer is changing, how their interests are changing, how what they want is changing. We're going to write about banking. We're going to write about legislation. Those big overarching things are what we're going to be interested in. So we're learning how to do that, just as we're trying to explain what we do to people in the industry who may not be familiar with kind of a wire service mission and how that differs from what the Post does or what MBJ does. So,
great, thank you.
Yeah, and since Joe talked a little bit about his personal story, I'll just say, I tried smoking weed in high school and I hated it. In Colorado Springs, it was some awful stuff and nobody had taught me how much I should smoke and I hated it. But in my early 20s, after I got out of the Air Force, I tried it again, and I realized that I'm actually thinking smarter, not thinking dumber. I think, at least. And so 10 years later, I started blogging, and I found that there was a really interesting intersection between music and cannabis and culture in cannabis, and I was kind of inspired by what was going on at Westward and the cannabis people who were writing about that from a true news angle. And so when I started at the DBJ about a year ago, I was asked what beats, what some gaps were in our coverage. And one of the things I really noticed, just based on my personal kind of curiosity, was cannabis. We weren't really covering it too much. We were covering it more as an oddity than anything else. And this is a big business in Colorado, and arguably it's a driving force behind the really strong economy and low unemployment rate that we enjoy in this city and state. So I told our new editor-in-chief this is somewhere where I think we should focus a little bit more. And we got my colleague Monica Vindatuli, who's in the audience today, who she covers, we just tacked it on to her series of beats along with law and banking, and she's done a really great job of letting our readers know about some of the challenges the cannabis companies face that the public really isn't aware of. The tax burdens thanks to 280E and the burdensome paperwork thanks to 8300, and we've really started covering it as a true beat, not as an oddity, not as this weird novel thing that's going on, but I think that it's really important. And the more I've gotten to know the cannabis community, the more I have just really become passionate about treating this industry as a legitimate industry, as legitimate as brewing, as legitimate as mining, as legitimate as really any other industry, as tech, anything else. And, it deserves attention, and it's just another beat, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it, and that's really all I have to say about that.
I appreciate you all sharing these stories. Couldn't agree more. I mean, covering cannabis is as important as covering alcohol, like Leanne said. It's as important as covering mining, like Jonathan said. And it's also fascinating because hearing these varied stories from these different outlets and perspectives, you see that there's this ebb and flow happening. The Denver Post had 7 full-timers covering cannabis not that long ago. I was one of them. And now there's 0 right now. DBJ, Denver Business Journal, is stepping up its cannabis coverage right now. And meanwhile, Marijuana Business Daily is hiring like mad, apparently. You have more than 20 editorial employees? My God, that's all covering cannabis. So yeah. But I want to talk, especially since we are here to talk about the complicated future, what is the public's demand or interest or desire for this information? Because we are seeing some outlets upping their staffing, and we're seeing other outlets cutting their staffing. So you guys are on the ground zero. I mean, Joe, you're watching your own metrics week by week for your podcast, and you're watching that ebb and flow there. Leanne, you're running the largest newspaper in the region. So can you speak to the public's desire for this information on this new industry? Because it still is a new industry. I mean, this was legalized recreationally. Sales began January 1st, 2014.
I would say for us, a lot of the interest isn't so much, and this just speaks to being a general interest newspaper versus a newspaper particularly focused on covering a business, any one business, like the Business Journal might be, or the trade publications might be. Our biggest interest has actually been around the tax money. How much is coming in, where it's going to. We have seen, I don't think any story has resonated, just generally for us, like looking into that. People are really interested in, we voted for this, and what's been the actual impact. The fact is that when we write a lot about marijuana, we get a lot of pushback. Still to this day, you get a lot of people, they claim, you overcover the industry, you're a cheerleader for the cheerleader for the industry is a ongoing and regular.
Still?
Oh yeah. People will count. You wrote about marijuana 7 times in the last 2 weeks, and it's like, well, probably that's possible. It's easily possible. So you do definitely get that. But so what we're finding with our readers is an enormous interest, though, in the tax dollar end of it. I myself still find all the parts about how it's becoming normalized into the industry. The way it plays out in the workplace has been a really big area for us. Anything that talks about how legal marijuana plays into everybody's everyday lives. That's kind of the intersection that really works for us. And we saw it, goodness, ourselves when we were hiring journalists. And we were having this really hard time. We just kept hiring people, and they couldn't start for like however many weeks. Well, because they couldn't pass their drug test until finally we changed our policies around that. So now we don't have to drug test anymore.
I can tell you stories about very long letters I wrote to our HR department, corporate in San Jose. But no, thank you.
Drug testing in a newspaper. So I don't have to do a drug test. I can tell you that much. So, we started our blog is subtitled and our podcast is High-Minded Conversations for the Post-Prohibition Era. Okay, so that's not a mainstream grabber, right? So I didn't really think this was going to go for long. I thought I was going to do a couple of episodes and it was just going to die. But last year in December, we had 45,000 downloads last year, which apparently is a pretty decent number in podcast. And we don't do we do very limited social outreach because we're only 3 people. We don't have any sponsorship because I've wanted to keep it sponsor free. I may have to change it. We're only supported by Patreon supporters, which is a sort of a crowdfunding place where people who like you just give you $1 or $10 a month. So we do it for very little money, to be quite honest. That will change. It has to, because now we're actually a thing. People really love podcasts. My partner is going to begin a podcast sort of production network. So to start grouping podcasts together, because it's really hard to find podcasts, right? There's no real organized system of discovery. It's not like going to Channel 7 and knowing what you're going to get. We don't have that system yet.
There is, but it's just Apple.
It's just Apple, right? And it's not very organized. So it's very interesting for me to sort of explore a new medium, which I like a lot, and can do. We came here with a portable sound studio. It's nothing. It's a backpack. So it's really portable, it's not expensive to do, and it gives us a chance to have conversations with people that aren't happening in the Denver Post or Marijuana Business Journal. We want to be looking at different conversations, and there's an audience, which is great.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in. That's one of the challenges that we're facing at the DBJ right now, which is to provide coverage of an industry that our existing readership really isn't used to looking to us for. Like I said, it's something that we've sporadically covered in the past, and we're really working to beef up that coverage, but we're doing it, I'm an editor, so it's something I do in what disguises itself as my free time, and it's one of Monica's half dozen beats. But we want to introduce our readership to not only the concept that this industry is a legitimate industry that deserves to be treated like any other industry, but also, these are the people, these are the players. We're making an effort to build a beat by telling big stories that I think people can relate to, like Colorado companies looking to Canada to launch into the international space, as well as more focused stories that are presenting the players to our readership. And while we're doing that, we're also getting to know them as well. So it works both ways. And that's going to be the trick, is can we turn this into, as Leanne mentioned earlier, something that our parent company, the American City Business Journals, thinks is profitable enough to continue. And so that's a big challenge, but it's something that I think I know that I'm having a fun time doing, and I think Monica is as well. And it's a great challenge.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Katie and Chris, I'm curious if either of you want to speak on, cannabis has been technically legal here since December of 2012 when Governor Hickenlooper signed it into the state constitution and sales began 13 months later. But what is that public desire, what is that public demand in Colorado and beyond right now for news and information?
Yeah, two quick answers to that. One is I've seen the evolution of the mainstream media and this beat. Again, we've been doing this for a long time in this industry. We call it, pot years internally, but 7 years, 8 years we've been doing this is 30 years. So we've seen how this has played out. And the first couple of years, I was shocked that mainstream media around the country and in Denver were not covering this. And they were not covering it like a serious industry. Everything was full of pot puns and Rocky Mountain High and green this and that. And it seemed like mainstream media was more interested in getting some kind of pun in the headline or lead than the actual story itself. Unless it was like a legislative development, then it would be, just a quick write-up. So what's happened is that, a lot of the mainstream media has come around. There are not a lot of reporters with cannabis beats, or that is their only beat. That is changing, and now they'll have cannabis and 5 other beats, which is kind of the way of the media now. In general, you can't focus on one area anymore, but it's been encouraging to see, and I do applaud the Post for starting the Cannabis. I remember thinking that was a huge move, that a mainstream media company would start a separately named publication just for a particular area like that, and that hasn't been done very often. So I thought the Denver Post was really ahead of the curve with that. And so now it's, the puns are starting to go away. The serious journalism is definitely coming into this, but I still think there's a disconnect. The Wall Street Journal or the New York Times should be covering this way. They seem to be in a way off over here and don't even think it's an issue anymore.
They are.
And it's crazy what I see in that. So I think the appetite is there. One of our big challenges is keeping the general reader out of what we do, because we need to be successful. We have to focus on entrepreneurs and like higher level investors and executives. And so that kind of pollutes or dilutes our audience if we're getting the average consumer or day trader looking at our stuff. It's just for our business model, it doesn't work. So there's huge demand. One of our biggest stories last year, we broke news that South Korea was going to legalize medical marijuana, and it was huge because now it's a global thing, but a lot of that's not, that shouldn't be the number 2 story we ever wrote on our site. But we got a lot of that traction because it was shared through social media and consumer sites.
And you guys broke that story, if I remember.
Yeah, right. So I think that the appetite is there, and newspapers I don't think have realized, not only from the business perspective but the consumer perspective, that this is a whole new area. Not to the degree of tech, but it's kind of like that in our lifetimes. This whole new area is cropping up, and I think they're behind the curve still. But
can I ask a question? Because from an outsider, okay, I thought the Cannabis was the coolest thing the Denver Post had ever done. And the question is, did they do their brand a disservice by axing it? Because I actually subscribed to it from New York. I'm not going to subscribe to the Denver Post generally. It's not on my high list of publications. Yeah, whatever. It's not my local. But the Cannabis kept me coming, and now it's gone. And I'm wondering what you think. Did they just sort of water down the brand or lose something by killing it?
Of course we lost something, which is why it isn't, like, there's still hope that we can figure this out. But I think the problem had been, if we could go back in time, and if I had a little time warp thing and go back to the beginning, one thing I would do different is charge for the content from the get-go. Like that started in the era just before it was really normalized to begin charging for your content. So it was all given away for free, and it was hugely popular, but it was really hard to get decent advertising around it, consistent advertising that you could count on. Businesses would advertise, and you go to collect the money, and they'd be gone, and and we weren't really sure where it was. So it was extremely difficult. So while it had this enormous following from readers, we weren't able to monetize off of that. So I would absolutely think that if I could go back in time, and you just learn these lessons, and that's how life in the business is, right?
Couldn't you get the advertising dollars now that there are established businesses and it's a real thing?
That hadn't been true a year ago. Now, whether that could happen now is and on the advertising side, it's not that different at a major newspaper than it is on the reporting side, where the ad reps, they don't necessarily just specialize in that one thing, and so it's a complicated stew. They're going after how many marijuana businesses and at what rate are you going in what is still, even after these years, an evolving business. That's just the fact. It's not like King Soopers or a big hospital that's really been around. So it takes a particular skill to figure that out. So I think that we would have served ourselves very well as a newspaper to have understood earlier on and had the courage to say, this is the market for this. We've now looked at the metrics and have determined this is really the biggest uses out of this are really looking at our consumers, or they're really businesses, or they're really this, or they're really that. This is what they're really looking for. Professionalize that part of the business, figured it out, let it evolve, let that site evolve in the way a brand new site should, to serve the customers that were most interested in it, and then charge for that content. That's what I would do differently.
It was an impossible situation at the time too. You have a mainstream daily newspaper that's accustomed to selling display ads and double trucks. And suddenly I'm like, hey, we have a podcast. It's really great. We're doing really well. Sell us sponsorships. And they had no idea how to do that.
Yeah.
We launched, and I think advertising always thought we were going to be this local news site. We were going to be Colorado Cannabis, and I never wanted it to be that. I always would tell Kevin and Leanne, we're going to cover the national industry. Send me to Uruguay to cover the world's first country to legalize cannabis. And to their credit, they did. But then advertising was like, wait a minute, we can't sell enough Colorado-specific ads because we have such significant readership in California, Texas, New York, and Michigan. So it was really difficult.
To the end of the day, California was one of our biggest markets on that site. Colorado, number one. I think it is to this day. I think it still is. And that continued even after our sister newspapers in California started up their own competing site. Don't even get into why that would have been. But Rick remembers that pretty well. They started up their own competing site with the same name. We had to threaten a lawsuit. It was a whole big mess. But and they ran into the same issue. So it wasn't that's not a strictly Colorado problem, not a strictly Denver Post problem I'm describing, but it's a problem for mainstream newspapers like ours.
I mean, it seems to me that the event you had tonight is the model for the future. It's very hard to be a legacy brand like the Denver Post and do something new. It's just very hard. There's no economic way to sustain it. They'll kill it. And yet, the two women who were here before us are able to sort of create from new. And somehow there has to be a merging of the legacy brand with the new. Because I don't know what you think. Do you really think the Denver Post could ever pull it off, really?
I do think so. I think we pulled it off for 3 years, for 4 years. And you look at what the Boston Globe is doing with stat news.
But they weren't willing to hold on. They weren't willing to see it
through
the valley.
Look what the Globe is doing with stat, their medical vertical. Yeah. And is the Globe's religion vertical still around? What was that called? Crux? The Boston Globe did a fantastic religion vertical that was like the Cannabis, but it just reported on Catholicism because you're in Boston. And they actually had a full-time reporter, journalist in the Vatican. It was so fascinating. So I do think that mainstream newspapers and entities can do this. But you know, I want to move on a little bit because you know, we're seeing this ebb and flow that we've been talking about. You know, the Cannabis is, for all intents and purposes, gone. The Green State was a major initiative on behalf of the San Francisco Chronicle that employed multiple full-timers, and now it's gone. We are seeing exciting things happen at the Boston Globe with their cannabis coverage, and throughout Canada as well. With a lot of these mainstream newspapers, the Financial Post, the Globe and Mail, creating these spin-offs, one of which is called the Growth Op. And if you're not paying attention to what they're doing, please do. It's really, really smart journalism in, of course, the first G7 country to ever legalize cannabis. So we're seeing ebb and flow. It's going up and down, but inevitably we're also seeing a downturn in the number of stories that journalists are covering, especially in this market right here where many of us live. And I want to ask the panel, you know, what are some of these stories that are going uncovered because of this downturn in some of the coverage? Because I guess Chris is hiring like mad over there, but at the same time, we just lost several voices at the Post and other situations. So what are some of these stories in the future of cannabis journalism that we're not seeing covered that we'd like to? Who would like to get us started?
You can go first on that
one. You know, we're trying to cover the business ones that we see, but we're tasked with an enormous duty to the industry too, because we're now global. So we have a reporter in Canada, editor in analyst in Germany, and we're covering this. So it's even hard for us to focus on the entire nation, you know, let alone the entire world. So you know, we can't even do it ourselves to the degree we want to as a trade publication. But I mean, I've always felt that there are probably some great stories if you lift the hood on this industry. They're not being told really anywhere. I mean, think about how this industry developed from the underground and quickly went, you know, sort of above ground with a lack of regulations. And so there are stories that would not shed a great light on the industry, of course, but from a journalism perspective could help things in the long run too. There's been the corruption allegations in some states about how licenses have been awarded because it's politicians making decisions and kind of rewarding people that have given them money or their connections. And there's still, to this day, I hear, even in Denver, some of the people running the operations, potentially from other countries with almost like mafia ties. And we still hear a lot of this, or diverting cannabis to other states. And that puts a black eye on the entire industry. And it's still going on, not just here, but in a lot of other states. So, connecting all the dots nationally to figure out how this experiment is going is what I'm not seeing. People are just focusing on one state or one development at a time, and they're not looking at the bigger picture. And that's where the mainstream media could really come in, and the New York Times could put someone on it for 6 months. And it doesn't mean it's a negative story. I just mean that there's a lot of things that are just going unreported. And seeing how this is playing out nationally, the good and the bad, is just a story that's no one's doing.
Katie, you and I grabbed tacos a couple months ago to talk about specifically these stories that weren't being covered, and now you've had all those months to kind of live in the beat a little bit more. So I'm curious your take on it.
No pressure. I was just going to say, I think that's when we talk about covering the industry in a serious way, that's part of it, is doing that kind of watchdog checks on politicians, on the industry. Is everybody following the rules that have been created to, set up and monitor and actually lift this to a place where it can be multi-million-dollar industry? I talk to pretty much everyone I meet with about diversity and equity in the industry. I think that's a big area where we don't know a lot. There's a lot of anecdotal guesses and information on what's out there. So I think that's an area where you need some real data. I know the Denver Post has done, some important work there trying to get access to state data with all the obstacles that are put in front of us there. So that's the immediate one that comes to mind for me. And that's not a negative story per se about the industry. I think it speaks to a lot of obstacles that exist in any industry for women and minorities. I've heard Wanda James talk about how it's hard to raise money, if you're in alcohol and you're a woman and a woman of color. It's hard to raise money if you're an accountant and you're a woman and a woman of color. It's hard to raise money in tech if you're a minority or you're a woman. So, I don't think it has to be looked at as a negative. It's illuminating issues where hopes and dreams that people had just are not coming to fruition.
Right, and me and Dave McGoya did go after the State Marijuana Enforcement Division and the Department of Revenue to try and get this data on the breakdown of female and ethnic minority ownership and management positions in this industry, and they weren't collecting it, and they aren't collecting it, and we ended up writing a big piece about that because it was important to point out. But any other panelists have a thought on, something that's going uncovered that needs to change, hopefully, as we discuss the future of cannabis journalism?
Well, I'm lucky. Am I on? I'm lucky that a lot isn't covered, because I get to talk to people and hear personal stories and people who are thinking about social equity, who are trying new models, or bioethicists, or athletes who are using cannabis for performance. So I'm looking at it, personal stories, and I'm personally interested in medical cannabis because of a person of a certain age. Medical cannabis is a really good remedy, and there's just not a lot of real information out of it. So I try to include a medical segment, maybe every episode, because I think people need that. I know patients want that information and need it, and it's, I'm working a lot on that level. So that's a whole different, you need to do what you're doing.
And really quickly, just to add one more thing is, not that a local or a regional newspaper or publication can do this, but the other thing I'm seeing is missing is connecting it to the global environment. So I've been traveling for a year and a half doing our international market research, and this is spreading like wildfire around the world, and very few people know that, outside of the U.S. They see Canada, sure, but, a dozen countries legalized last year, and several have already moved in that direction this year, all over the world. And it's spreading into places like Asia, where there was a lot of resistance, and Africa, and so you can see where this is going globally. And so there's a lot of ways that is going to impact our industry and our economy in the long run, and the U.S. is positioning in this brand new sector. So I think, again, it's really focused on that local, and it might just be a city or a state, but not the national picture or the global.
And isn't it thrilling? Because for so long, all we were talking about was Colorado, Washington, and Uruguay, and now there's so much more to discuss, thankfully.
I was just going to add that it's an interesting part about the normalization of marijuana into Colorado, that when I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, agreeing, that whether the regulations are working, whether people are following the rules, whether it's working out like it's supposed to, you could put that exact conversation, fill this room with oil and gas industry, and have the same discussion. Like, I would say every single thing you said could be said about that industry, that's not being adequately covered. So you do sort of see that's where it's all the same. That's where it's become so much part of the mainstream.
Well, it's interesting as we watch this transition, is cannabis journalism going to be cannabis-specific outlets like Marijuana Business Daily or The Cannabis? The future of this space, is it going to be mainstream outlets stepping up and covering this beat as the industry that deserves to be covered? I guess time will tell, but maybe if we can leave with just one question for the panel. I mean, what are your hopes? What's a hope that you have for the future of this specific minute space of all of journalism? And journalism is so near and dear to my heart. It's vast. There are technically more important elements of journalism, but this is what we're here to discuss tonight. I mean, Joe said earlier, this is the Silicon Valley of weed. So what's your hope for the future of cannabis journalism? Jonathan, you want to get us started? And whoever would like to speak to it, please do.
Yeah, and not to beat a dead horse, but I really, my hope for the future of cannabis journalism is that it's no longer treated as a novelty, that it's treated as the legitimate industry that it is. And I think that there are a lot of great stories that aren't being told. I am a little concerned, depending on potential legislation that passes and the potential for mass and rapid consolidation, that we, as the media in Colorado, may have missed a million amazing stories, that will just vanish. But I am hopeful that the beat is considered just another piece of a newspaper's menu, and I'm excited to see it go global. I'm excited to see how the United States plays a role in that, and specifically how Colorado plays a role in that. And, as far as how it will be treated within papers, I think it should be treated as an individual beat. I think that resources like MJ Biz Daily are amazing resources. We lean on them a lot for some of the insight that they have that we're not able to pull together ourselves. And that's really about it.
Right on. Katie, anything to add?
I would say I hope the variety that we see now continues to exist, that mainstream local newspapers continue to commit and grow their coverage of this industry, that those dots that Chris was talking about start to get connected by national and international outlets, but that you can still find people who want to tell personal stories the way that the podcast does. I mean, I think that's how you want to cover any industry. It comes down to the people behind it and those bigger overarching trends. I mean, if you lose either of those, you're sort of losing the grasp on it, to me, from a media coverage perspective. I don't know if we're going down the line or not.
Yeah, I hope we can make a little money this year. I have very limited expectations of cannabis journalism. But we all hope. I was going to say we all hope that. But I think it is important that there's a weird balance. You brought it up tonight. It's like the advertising isn't there to support a lot of the effort in many cases, and somehow I hope they meet each other, or else things are going to slide away in some ways. And it's a weird, funny balance, and that's the way that media in America's been, and maybe it's changing. I don't know, but that's my hope, is that they can support each other somehow.
Yeah, that's pretty close to what I was going to say. I'm hoping that the finances exist to support it. I'm also excited, and you can see it already happening. In the earliest days, you weren't really a legitimate reporter covering the industry unless you used or were part of the industry. And our last reporter who left to go to a great fellowship, a business writing fellowship, she was like really conflicted about when we said we're going to have you cover marijuana, because you remember this, right? Like, can I put on my business card I don't use? And we're like, no, that'd be weird. You can't do that. So that we're the journalists who are covering it, and where the whole industry is so much normalized that you can actually bring your best talent to bear, regardless of anything. And I think that would be a really great step forward in allowing us to cover the industry in the most thoughtful and important way possible.
Which is interesting, because just briefly, I know so many people approached me during my days at the Cannabis and the Post, and they would tell me, thank you for normalizing this. And that was not my goal. It couldn't have been my goal, because I was practicing journalism, and I was just treating this as if it was the airline industry or oil and gas, but by treating it like it was... I had a little bit more fun than that, okay. But by treating it like the airline industry or oil and gas, I was normalizing it, and I didn't even realize it at the time. But Chris, your hope for the future of cannabis journalism.
Yeah, well, we tried to hire that reporter, by the way. Didn't work out, but yeah, she was very good.
I'm going to take her back.
We'll see. No. She's very talented. Yeah, exactly. So I think my hope for the future is honestly that it kind of mimics what technology did in some ways for journalism, in the sense that it's still diverse, as was mentioned earlier. You have numerous consumer-focused publications on various aspects of technology. You have a lot of business publications. Most newspapers have someone focused on the tech side for something. Again, whether it's the consumer side or the companies that are in their communities, the big tech companies or whatever. So I would, and that still is around. A lot of the publications didn't necessarily make it, but you still have a lot of different kinds of journalism being done around tech because it's so integral to our lives. Now, cannabis won't get to that level, and I think there is a novelty to it in some respects to certain publications where right now in this time they might be able to do it, but in the long run, it's going to become a regular industry and a regular consumer product, and we kind of know how that's evolved in other industries and in other products, so we can see where that will end up. But if it ends up diverse and there's opportunities for journalists to cover this in various ways and different perspectives out there, I mean, that would be my hope for where this evolves.
Well, I've got to say, the five people to my right, I think cannabis journalism is in good hands. Joe, clearly a funny guy, but he said something just now that there's truth to it. He hopes that his podcast makes money. He hopes that the Denver Post continues to thrive, and Marijuana Business Daily and the other outlets up here. But, this also comes down to you guys. You play a role in this. Every time you share a Denver Post story, the Denver Post is behind a paywall now. You pay $12 a month to access the best local journalism in the region. It's pennies. It's nothing. Every time you donate to Joe's Patreon, so you are in charge of making sure that there is a future for cannabis journalism. And I would very much like to thank my staff. You'll see these beautiful people in the Grasslands t-shirts. I'd like to thank my panel, our earlier panel on social media influencers. And of course, I'd like to thank you guys. God, you guys packed out the Denver Press Club. Bravo. We'll be downstairs. Let's have some more drinks and continue the conversation. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Have a good night.
You can like and follow the Brave New Weed podcast on all the best social media platforms. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bravenewweed or on Twitter @bravenewweed or Instagram @bravenewweed.
Thanks for listening to the Brave New Weed podcast. This episode and all future episodes are made possible by amazing listeners like yourself. If you like what you've heard, we encourage you to show your support by giving $1 a month for special access and rewards on patreon.com/bravenewweed. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram via @bravenewweed. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bravenewweed. And remember, you can always find more information about us or information discussed in each episode by pointing your favorite browser to bravenewweed.com.